This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, available only on YouTube.
Thank you very much. Our panel today is the basics of restructuring, alternative paths to reform. We're going to be answering a lot of the questions that came up in the first panel. We have a great lineup for you. I am not going to read every bit of the bios. They're in your packets, but let me introduce our speakers in the order in which they will speak. So our first speaker will be Tom Lockhart, who's the Managing Director of Public Finance at Stone & Youngberg. He has been an investment banker since 1984. Our next two speakers are going to do a kind of a tag team approach as a presentation. And to my right is Natasha Carl, who is a lobbyist and has been with the League of California Cities for 5 years. And she's going to give a presentation together with, alternating with Michael Sweet, who's a partner in the San Francisco office of Fox Rothschild, a national law firm. The last presentation will be given by Duff Sondheim, who has been the chairman of the California Republican Party from 2003 to 2007, active in state and national politics for 30 years. So I have asked each of our panelists to talk for no more than 12 minutes to make sure we have a good opportunity for discussion. So let me turn it over first to Tom.
Thanks, Margaret. I think I've got a PowerPoint presentation for Peter. Okay. You'll see from the title that I call it the IGS conference, and I refuse to call it a crisis. A crisis is what you've got in Syria or Bangladesh. What we've got here in California is not a crisis. And if you want to see a wonderful exhibit on times in California when there were crises, the 68 exhibit at the Oakland Museum of Art is just absolutely fabulous and highly recommended. But we open with, by show of hands, how many people recognize this gentleman? Okay, this will help define the audience. This is, of course, Ronald Reagan before he met Jenny Craig. No, this is Howard Jarvis, and this all started. This whole conversation began with Prop 13 in 1978, and if you Google Prop 13 or if you search Prop 13 and go to YouTube, there are some wonderful clips, and I picked this up from our governor, who was governor in 1978. It takes too much out of the public sector. $7 billion, which in Peter's words is adult money. In 1978, that is adult money, which would jeopardize our bonds, which we've talked a little bit about already, our fire departments, this is important, our police, our schools, which were referred to earlier, and our other projects. And part of the theme here will be, and we'll drill down a little bit more than where Michael was, and Michael is absolutely the state's expert on fiscal matters. On the local government level, this is really about fire and police services, and at the end of the day, the revenues that are used to pay for them are really coming from property taxes and sales taxes. So we don't need to make it very complicated. This can really be simplified. But we'll start with some issues that I'd like to get through in this presentation. That basically bond defaults are rare. We'll go on to talk about bankruptcies, or even rarer, charters, which we talked about in the prior panel a good bit, influence the fiscal stress, and we'll talk about charters and what their import is. How much debt is too much, which has already come up in the questioning. There's another issue that I want to get at in my 12 minutes about the seasonality of fiscal stress, because there is a rhythm in California to when things happen. And then we'll look at near-term trends, which include the demolition of redevelopment agencies. But here, just to put some numbers on it, and this is really what I want you to focus on. Municipal defaults from 58 to 2001. If you look at what's here, you're not seeing Stockton, San Bernardino, Vallejo, Mammoth Lakes, pick another problem. You're really seeing industrial development bonds, housing, nursing homes, healthcare, special assessments, retirement, and some other. And so most of these are economic development related. They're not really about a city collapsing. And when you look at it generally, in a $3.4 trillion municipal bond market, with California representing about 15% of that, and knowing that about 87% of the debt that's outstanding in California is investment grade, triple B plus rated or better, you really don't have that much of an opportunity for a default and for a restructuring, which I know so many people here are interested in. You're really looking at, according to Moody's, 72 defaults between 70 and 11, 47 defaults between 86 and 11. The universe is quite small, and we're going to talk a little bit more about where those defaults really have been, but it's really not in general obligation and essential service obligations. It's generally in economic development related debt. Again, defaults are rare. Bankruptcies are even rarer. Michael and Tracy talked about this earlier, but in California there are 58 counties, 480 cities. Charter cities, there's about 120. Those are cities in California that have their own constitution. There's about 3,400 special districts and school districts. So we've got a very large universe of things that the media can write about. So in a state of 38 to 40 million people, representing about 15% of a $3.4 trillion municipal market, there are going to be plenty of things to write about in California. But when you look at the four recent bankruptcies, Vallejo, Stockton, Mammoth Lakes, and San Bernardino, with the toss out of Mammoth Lakes because it was, as Michael pointed out, about a legal problem or a legal judgment, Vallejo, Stockton, and San Bernardino, what do you find? Is there a trend there? Well, yeah, maybe there is. Vallejo, Stockton, and San Bernardino are all charter cities that all have embedded into them organized labor agreements that make it very difficult for local decision-making to adjust to a contraction in property tax revenues and sales tax revenues. So it's that stickiness that's created by the charter in combination with the economic contraction which creates some of the difficulty. And if you're trying to look for trends, you might want to pay attention to those cities that have charters, that have embedded in them organized labor contracts that make it very difficult to adjust. So out of those 480, we've got basically 3 communities that have had difficulty. Vallejo's out of bankruptcy. Stockton and San Bernardino are actively involved. I believe Mammoth is settled. But let's emphasize, when you look at the median, you look at what ostensibly is this crisis in California, 3 communities out of 480, we're really not talking about schools defaulting or going bankrupt. And we've talked briefly previously about the state interceding with the schools. We're not talking about essential service utilities, which in California are largely operated by local public agencies that have monopoly rate setting authority. We're not talking about those. And people like Terry have done very well by buying those, and the price has been bid up. And in fact, school district GO bonds had been a really good play in the municipal market until about 2.5 weeks ago when the Wall Street Journal finally got wind of it and said, you know, with all the negative publicity about California's fiscal stress, general obligation bonds for California schools seem like a pretty darn good investment. So you actually saw some trading differences there. It's not the redevelopment agencies. Those are limited tax bonds secured by tax increment revenues, which Peter referred to earlier. Those aren't part of the situation, although the elimination of redevelopment does affect how local government operates and takes away from it the opportunity right now for doing any economic development, and does, once again, focus local government service provision on police and fire. And it's not the special tax districts or assessment districts. Those are generally used for horizontal infrastructure to prepare for development. It's been in California. We have a philosophy in California that goes back to the 19th century that has new development paying for itself. So we had the 1915 Act, but before the 1915 Act, we had the 1898 Act. And now we had the Mello-Roos Special Tax Bond Act of 1982. Moving on, and this is a lot of words on paper, but this picture from San Bernardino does illustrate the point that I'm making. So when you look at the Pac-Man yellow portion of this pie chart for 2012, and you look at the expense profile or expenditure profile for the city of San Bernardino, 3/4 of that is public safety. And that's generally the situation in California. So when you're talking about fiscal stress in local government in California, you're talking about the provision of police and fire services. We're looking, as Terry Good from Wells brought up earlier, we actually are looking, we've got a matrix that we're looking at of cities that have been mentioned with having fiscal stress, and then we've looked at them across maybe 50 different parameters of what's available in public information. Keeping in mind, the public information is usually about a year to 18 months behind. But what we do look for, indicators that we do look for are fiscal stress is often predicted by frequent management turnover. Very important. Mike referred to that earlier. We look for that. We look for the failure to file timely, how many, I've got 5 minutes, thank you. File timely budgets and comprehensive annual financial reports. It's shocking. You can just go and look at a community to see if they filed the CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. There's a real good hint that there's a problem if they're behind on that. They can also declare fiscal emergency. Why do cities in California declare fiscal emergency? Well, the reason they do that is so that they can actually get a revenue measure on the ballot at an election where there are not local people being elected. Okay, so many communities, a handful in California out of the 480, have declared fiscal emergency. Why? Because they want to put a revenue measure that requires a 50% vote on the ballot this November. So a client that I'm particularly close to, which has been mentioned in the media, is Fairfield. Fairfield, horribly responsible, did your 10-year financial planning, wonderful group of very highly skilled professionals. They knew what was going on with their situation. They've declared fiscal emergency. They have a sales tax initiative on the ballot for a local sales tax to help plug a hole. If they don't, what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be a contraction in police and fire service. Response times are going to go up, and that's going to be the consequence. So general fund appropriation obligations are most at risk. So we look at, well, how much actual general fund obligations are there? And what you'll find when you look at that closely, it's not that large. Okay, I've already mentioned that these are not, the special revenues and the enterprise districts are not part of the story, but if you're looking for an investment opportunity, you heard it here, take Stockton Unified School District. It's secured by a general obligation tax, but it has a reputational problem because it's got Stockton in its title. And you'll see trading differences as you look at the entities that share the names, as you look across those communities. So the impact of this fiscal emergency or the bankruptcy hints affect the other debt, although from a security point of view, nothing's been affected and it creates an investment opportunity. And I'm not here for a sales pitch, but maybe I am. How much debt is too much? And this was a question that was asked earlier, but this is just a small portion of the matrix that we keep it. Just to say the words, and not to pick on any city, but we're looking at whether it's a charter or a general law, whether there's been a declaration of a fiscal emergency, whether they've got the Governmental Finance Officers Association certificate for filing their CAFR on time. You can find just with that. That's not a number. Did they do it? Did they get it? It's an important. You'll find that you'll see trends if you look for that. We then look at the ratings. We know that the rating agencies, which are publishing companies, generally tend to be behind. Well, why are they behind? Well, the data reporting's behind, and that's how it works, and you can't get it out any sooner. And so they are publishing companies. They're not government agencies, and there is risk in the world, and they help us try to sort that out. Outstanding general fund appropriation debt. So let's look at Hercules, which has been in the news. Okay, it's a general law city. It's declared a fiscal emergency. No, it doesn't have a GFOA certificate. The ratings have been removed. It's got about it's got a double B S&P, which is junk, is non-investment grade. It's got outstanding general fund appropriation debt of about $17 million. On an annual basis, that's about $1.5 million. That's not a crisis, okay? Syria is a crisis, okay? Now, there's some other issues going on in Hercules that you want to pay attention to. But the other things we look at, and the reason why you've got some gaps here is because they haven't managed to deliver their 2011 audited financial report. Is that an issue? Yeah. Does the controller get involved in that? Yeah, I think the controller is doing an absolutely wonderful job with the resources that he and that office have available to assist local government. But there's been a lot of stuff going on in this community, but even if you didn't know, if you haven't read the paper, you would be able to see by taking a quick look at that where the gaps are and where the problems are. The other thing that's going to be talked about here to tee up the rest of the presenters, there is going to be a conversation about the actuarially required contribution to the pension. And when you look at what percentage that is of the annual general fund budget, we're talking between 3 and 17%, or 18%. That's the contribution to the pension. Now, the trend is that that's growing, okay? That's troubling. The debt, which is to answer the question, how much debt is too much? In most communities, you'll see that the amount of debt, annual obligation is less than 10%. In a community like Stockton, which is very much in the news, when the obligations at Stockton sold for its general fund entered the market, that was 10 to 11% of their annual budget. It's now, with the contraction, maybe 15%. So you've got, I'm trying to provide some dimensions for you so you see how, so you see, relatively speaking to the operation of a local government, what the debt and the pensions mean. Obviously, it's troubling in an economic contraction that they can't meet their obligations, or that their actuarially required contribution to their pension requirements is growing, but in an expansion or in a reduction of service, you should be able to manage your way through that. Near-term trends, okay, if you know, this is Sproul Plaza, this is the Occupy movement, that's separate. There's a seasonality to local government fiscal stress. Budgets are created in the spring. Stockton declared a problem in February, March. It's not coincidental, okay? As communities begin to look at the coming fiscal year and do their planning, you're going to hear news then. It's unlikely that you're going to hear news now, except for the election. So what Michael Coleman does for everybody in the state is a great service. He prepares a report of all the local revenue initiatives. So if you're following this closely and you want to see where there's going to be distress, pick up Michael's report, look at all those, then follow the local newspapers to see which initiatives passed and which failed. And you'll have a very good indication in November where things might be going. But there is a seasonality. Our fiscal years, I think, as Tracy mentioned, start July 1 and June 30. There's a, please wrap up. Okay, thank you. We've talked about a lot of this. The other thing that's going to happen that's going to make news, and you're going to hear from the judge later this afternoon in Stockton, whenever there's a brief that's been filed or a statement's been made, that's going to be news, and it's going to bring more attention to what's going on here. There's also the conversation that we're now going to hear from the rest of the panel on AB 506 and what that's done, and Duff's going to be speaking about pension reforms. And then finally, dude, where's my redevelopment agency? And this gets back to where Peter was. If you look about here, I think that's about $3.8 million in new bond debt service in 06. That's about 140 new issues, or around 120 to 140 new issues. Very active involvement in California in doing economic development with tax increment finance. As Peter mentioned earlier, that's now gone. Cities are dealing with this. You know, it's one thing to say, okay, we've lost that, administratively you have to deal with it. But it's happening in the context of a 5 to 6 year economic contraction. So you've, as Mike and Peter mentioned, the resources locally to deal with that contraction are very difficult. And so in order to see it resolved, you really have to imagine that on the local level, with the controller and with the Department of Finance, there's going to be some very interesting conversations about getting that straightened out. Do I believe it's a crisis? No. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. So our next presenters are going to trade off together, Michael Sweet and Natasha Carl. And they're going to be dealing with the AB 506.
Good morning. Thank you very much for coming. I was commenting to someone out in the hallway that it's great as a practitioner who spends a lot of the time sitting in office and some time in court to get back out into the academic world and see what's going on here and be able to participate in this. It's really a treat. We're going to talk a bit about kind of the mechanics of getting into bankruptcy. There's another panel this afternoon, and wonderful group of folks who are going to talk more about what happens when you get in and how the restructuring itself works. So if you have questions that are unanswered by what we're presenting, it's not because we're avoiding, it's because we're saving the best for the folks who have a lot to say about it. But with that said, we'll talk very, very briefly about bankruptcy and how you get in. Chapter 9 is the section of the Bankruptcy Code that applies to municipalities. It's very rarely used, and I'll talk about how rarely in a second. It is distinct from other chapters in the code, which folks are probably more familiar with, Chapter 7, which is a liquidation, or Chapter 11, which is a reorganization. Chapter 9 deals with municipal debt restructuring, and it is reserved solely for municipalities, and it's very infrequently seen. It was put into the Bankruptcy Code, I think, in 1938 or 39 during the Great Depression. There have been fewer than 800 total Chapter 9 filings since 1937. And to put that in perspective, in 2010, there were more than 250,000 filings in California alone, which at an average means there were 961 per day. In other words, at the peak of things a couple of years ago, there were more filings every day in the state of California than we've ever seen under Chapter 9. And that is, among other things, what leads to a lot of the uncertainty we have with Chapter 9 and unanswered questions. There's a dearth of decisional authority, and there's a dearth of expertise in the area, and it causes a flurry of activity when people start talking about Chapter 9 or when someone utters the B word at a city council meeting. So, can a local government file for Chapter 9? Not all of them can. The Bankruptcy Code section that says if you can file is Code Section 109C, and it says that a municipality can seek Chapter 9 protection when it's specifically authorized to do so. And in California, for the first time, we actually have, as of this year, a limitation on whether or not a municipality, or under what circumstance a municipality should be able to file in California. Some states allow filings without any limitation at all. Some states have restrictions like California has, and about half the states simply don't allow a municipality to file bankruptcy. And as I've said, prior to 2012, there was no limitation on Chapter 9 filing in California, but recently we have had introduced AB 506, and Natasha will talk a little bit about how we got it and what the politics were behind it, Vallejo, labor. But prior to AB 506, there was not a limitation on municipalities filing bankruptcy, although in the 80s, the legislature, or maybe the early 1990s, the legislature did introduce some limitations that were intended to limit school districts going in after Richmond Unified and filed bankruptcy. But aside from those, there haven't been, until this year, any limitation on municipality filing. Again, you'll hear more about what happens in Chapter 9 from the afternoon panel, but essentially, in order to qualify under, this is under the Bankruptcy Code, the federal code, not AB 506, a city, it has to be a municipality, it has to be entitled to, or it has to be enabled under state law. It has to be insolvent, which means either it's not paying its debts when they come due, or it will be unable to do so, or is unable to do so, and it has to intend to readjust its debts. Finally, there's a requirement under the federal bankruptcy code of negotiating with creditors before you go into bankruptcy. And this is relevant because it appears duplicative of what we see in AB 506, which the California legislature passed last year. Under AB 506, there's a requirement that there be a mediation. And the notion was, and again, Natasha will talk more about how we got there, the notion was that if folks were just talking to each other, if people were at the table talking, then maybe we wouldn't see bankruptcies, we'd see resolution. Well, the bankruptcy code actually requires under Section 109C that under most circumstances, the parties should have negotiated, and they should have negotiated in good faith unless negotiations are impracticable or unless there's some exigency that would, a creditor action that would prevent the negotiations from happening. So to the folks last year who were concerned that we needed some regulation in California to prevent people from filing bankruptcy willy-nilly, my response was, we already have that. The bankruptcy code requires the good faith negotiation. For political reasons, that didn't resonate. And so, my take on AB 506 is that it came out of Vallejo after several failed attempts to introduce a limitation in Sacramento. And to tee this up for Natasha, here's what we know about Vallejo in rough terms. When the dust all settled, I think Vallejo's bankruptcy plan saved about $26 million, give or take. And if there's someone who's got a better number out there, let me know. But 20-something million dollars, 26. And from what we know, and these numbers are not precise, the costs, just the dollars out to lawyers and consultants and experts, exceeded $13 million. And that's before the cost of the black eye, the continuing crime, the articles you continue to see in the paper about how bad things are in Vallejo, which is something else that it's an intangible. It's hard to quantify that cost. And so the question becomes, 13 million plus this intangible number, is it worth the savings of 26? And it may be something that Tom could talk about a little bit later in terms of the intangibles. Is he can quantify for you what it's going to cost Vallejo in dollars when it goes out with an offering. But I mean that's there are all sorts of numbers attached. I would posit it probably wasn't enough of a savings to warrant it, but sometimes these things are inevitable. And Natasha, you want to jump in here on how we got here?
Hi, good morning. So Michael summed up my presentation in 2 words. How did we get to AB 506? It was Vallejo and the labor lobby in Sacramento, really. But what I want to share with you is a little bit of that historical perspective, how we got there. It was a 3-year battle in the legislature. It was very highly politically contentious. It was probably one of the most politically contentious issues I worked on in the last 5 years. Because you had one of the most powerful lobbies in Sacramento, the California Professional Firefighters, who were very upset coming out of the Vallejo bankruptcy, seeking to severely restrict or prohibit a municipality from being able to file a Chapter 9 petition. So in 2009, AB 155, authored by Assemblymember Tony Mendoza, was introduced. And the overall goal, I will say, of CPF, again, was to put some sort of a state gatekeeper in place to be the decision maker on whether or not a municipality could actually file. Because currently in California, the municipality is the decision maker in this process. So the League's goal in the 3 years that we worked on this issue was to continue to protect that local decision-making authority. In AB 155, the gatekeeper model was given to the California Debt Investment and Advisory Commission, or CIDIAC. This is a body made up of elected officials. There's a couple of assembly members, a couple of senators. The state treasurer serves as the chair, the controller's involved, Department of Finance and the governor are involved in this commission. And CIDIAC would have been given the authority to make the decision to whether or not a municipality could file a petition. So the League, again, we opposed this gatekeeper model because, again, we wanted to make sure that the decision remained at the local level. And I think our worst fear under this model was that if a municipality was, for all intents and purposes, insolvent and was unable to file a Chapter 9 petition and seek the protections of the court, what happens if CIDIAC says no and the agency runs out of cash? Do they stop paying their bills? Do they tell their labor force not to come in and work? Who picks up the trash? Is the state going to come in and pick up your city's trash? That's certainly not going to happen. So the question of what happens next was never answered, and we were very concerned about that. So AB 155 moved through the Assembly pretty much unscathed. It was moved through on party line votes, so the Democrats supporting labor and the provisions of AB 155, and the Republicans opposing it. I think they saw the league's position as needing to keep this decision local. They supported that decision. And so once AB 155 left the Assembly and got to the Senate, it hit a major roadblock. And its first policy committee in the Senate Local Government Committee at the time, Senator Lois Wolk was very, very critical, Democrat, very, very critical of the way that AB 155 had been drafted. She did not like the provisions, and she would not vote for the bill. And without her vote, the bill could not get out of that committee.
And she represents Vallejo.
Oh, thank you. Yes, very important. So she understood. So I think she understood quite well after, what was going on, and again, the provisions of AB 155 were so restrictive that I think she understood quite well that it would pose a lot of problems. So she didn't put up the vote on that bill, and so it remained in that committee until the next year. And then at the end of the 2009 legislative session, at the very end of session, it was just a couple of days before the end of session, Senator DeSaulnier amended SB 88. It was a gut and amend is what it's called. This is when the contents of a bill are completely removed and then replaced with something else. And again, it was an end of session move. Again, the California Professional Firefighters sponsoring this. And all the municipal associations and others were very opposed to it. We worked very hard on it, and that end of session deal did not come together. It did not move. So that brings us to 2010. Again, AB 155 resurfaces. It comes back to life because both Senator DeSaulnier and Senator Wolk sit down and they come together on a compromise. Senator Wolk, it was very important to her that an additional option be placed into the bill. So in addition to having CIDIAC be the decision maker, a second option was put into the bill. This second option would have required a municipality to seek an audit from the state auditor first before being able to file a petition. And the league was very concerned about this process. It wasn't that we didn't want someone to come in and audit. It was that the auditor could not put a time frame around when the audit would be completed. And what we wanted to ensure was that we knew at a definitive time period of when a municipality would be able to file, and we could not be given that, which makes sense. I mean, I don't think you want to put a time frame around when an audit or how long an audit should take. But because we couldn't have that a definitive amount of time, we couldn't support the proposal, so we continue to oppose it. And it still contained the flawed CIDIAC process, which we couldn't support either. So with these amendments, the bill moved out of the Senate Local Government Committee, and it moved through the rest of the process through its fiscal committee. And on the last night of session, again, through the efforts of the Municipal Association lobby and others, we were able to stop the bill. It actually did not get taken up for a vote, and I believe that the reason it did not get taken up is because it didn't have the number of votes that it needed to get off the floor. So that gets us to 2011 and AB 506. So you have several failed attempts in 2009 and 2010 by the California Professional Firefighters. And in 2011, they have another bill, completely different than what we had seen before. And that was introduced by Assemblymember Bob Wieckowski from the Bay Area, by trade, a bankruptcy attorney, not municipal bankruptcy, but a bankruptcy attorney. And Michael will discuss the specific provisions of AB 506. So what I'll just say is that we had originally opposed the first iteration of AB 506, but through the efforts of Senator Lois Wolk, in conjunction with the governor's office, they forged a deal with our associations and with the author's office to develop what is AB 506. And so we were able to remove our opposition once that bill had been amended. So the one thing I'll say is that the reason why we changed our position from earlier versions with AB 155 is because with AB 506, the municipality still maintains the discretion to file the Chapter 9 petition. It just requires that you sit down and have a conversation, albeit you were already required to do that under the law. But and that's part of the reason why we liked this process, because it didn't make it too much. It provided a formal framework for that discussion. I don't know if I would say it's perfect. I think we're still trying to figure that out, whether or not, and what it does in the process. And I think as more entities, or hopefully not too many more entities, actually go through the process, we'll understand. Huh?
No, heaven forbid.
Yeah, right. So then the governor signs AB 506, and it becomes effective January 1st. And then 4 months later, this year, Assemblymember Wajkowski introduces AB 1692. And this bill, he said, was a technical cleanup bill to AB 506. Mind you, at the time, none of the cities that were in the mediation process had even completed it, so no one knew what changes, if any, needed to be made. And so of course, we were very skeptical, and our reading of it was not technical in nature. It was very substantive. It would have created it would have increased the timeline immensely for the mediation process. So we were opposed to this effort. And the editorial boards were very critical of Wajkowski's decision to come back 4 months later and try to change a process that where a deal was forged. And the legislature finally recognized that this was an issue as well. And I think we're very critical of Wajkowski's decision. So the bill ended up not moving this year. And with that, I'll actually turn it back over to Michael so he can talk about 506.
So just to follow on two things Natasha said, she mentioned the editorial boards came out against this. As a bankruptcy practitioner, and not just municipal bankruptcy, but other areas of bankruptcy as well, I can't tell you that, but once have I seen newspapers actually on the editorial page, and the Chronicle and the LA Times did it, and Sacramento Bee, I think all the same week, actually have an editorial about legislation pending that would affect the ability, to file bankruptcy. That's not true. Actually, when they changed the federal bankruptcy code in 2005, it became more anti-consumer. I think there were some editorializations at the time. But it was to see this and to see this archaic concept, something that most people just don't get, on the editorial pages of the three big papers at the same time was pretty extraordinary, and obviously a nerve had been hit. And as a bankruptcy practitioner, a cautionary word for the concept of the gatekeeper, the state as the gatekeeper. If you go into the emergency room with, a scratch or a sprain or something like that, something that you can be triaged and can take a little while, and they make you fill out forms while you're waiting, that's something that probably wouldn't appall people. But would you be appalled if you get picked up in an ambulance because you just had a heart attack and you're taken into the emergency room? Before they roll the gurney through the doors, they stop you to fill out the forms? You can't have a gatekeeper when you're in certain extreme situations. And sometimes in bankruptcy, you don't have the time, you don't have the room to get into this discussion. You can't stop and fill out insurance forms. You're having a heart attack. Get them in the emergency room, and that's kind of where you end up with someone in Sacramento saying the circumstances under which a city in extremis or a local government of any kind in extremis may be able to file. And so with only 5 minutes of our shared time remaining, we'll now actually talk about what we're talking about, which is exactly what AB 506 does. AB 506 introduced this neutral evaluation process that we've been talking about. It provides that either a retired judge or some other expert in finance or bankruptcy bring everyone to the table, all the big players, people who have claims over $5 million or 5% of the debt are invited to sit down and talk for 60 days. It can be extended, and Stockton was extended for another 30 days to try to work things out, to try to come up with what? Well, with a plan that can be taken to a bankruptcy judge. I mean, that's kind of the end game, is try to work things out. But AB 506, you can't be forced to the table, which is what we saw in Mammoth Lakes. Mammoth Lakes is a city that I think has a $17 million annual general fund, and they had, $38 million judgment against them? 43. So it was some multiple of the general fund, and this is a judgment by developer, breach of contract case, and they lost, and they had a huge judgment against them. And we frequently see that in bankruptcy. You have a judgment against you, you can't pay, you're unable to pay your debt, so you go into bankruptcy. It happens in the private sector all the time. So Mammoth Lakes has to stop at AB 506, and they say, we want to talk. And the judgment creditor, the developer who had this judgment, said, we got nothing to talk about. Now, it may be different if you have skin in the game, which is, I think, why the discussion in Stockton went a little bit better, because the police officers, public safety generally, the other folks, public employees, they're part of the fabric of the community. They're invested in seeing the community get through this, and move on in a way that a judgment creditor who's a developer who's, you know, just out there to make money isn't. So AB 506 clearly didn't work in the situation like Mammoth Lakes. And it arguably it didn't work in Stockton because they ended up in bankruptcy, although some folks say that having folks at the table did begin the process and maybe leading to a quicker resolution of things. Then there's a second alternative under AB 506, which I'm sure is what brought along folks like League of Cities and others. It's what Tom refers to as the freeway off-ramp, the escape hatch. It's a way to avoid AB 506 completely, and this is what happened in San Bernardino. If you can declare a fiscal emergency, then you don't have to stop at the negotiation process. And declaring a fiscal emergency would require certain findings. You can't pay your debts. You have to agree to hold public hearings. But you can then move, you know, do not pass go straight to bankruptcy, which is, again, what they did in San Bernardino. And so here's the 3 case studies. Stockton, they had 60 days of mediation. They extended it 30. They came up on the end of the fiscal year. They didn't have resolution. They filed bankruptcy. Mammoth Lakes, as I've said, with a judgment creditor, no skin in the game, wouldn't participate in mediation, but after filing bankruptcy, Judge Paris, a bankruptcy judge from Oregon, was called in as a neutral, and she helped work out a settlement. I think we'll see that bankruptcy case go away rather shortly. And finally, San Bernardino, which is straight to fiscal emergency. And very quickly from the crystal ball, what are we going to see?
We are
Next.
definitely going to see continued legislative efforts to restrict a municipality's ability to file. We saw it with 1692 this year. I think CPF will be back next year trying to work on this as well. And I think as we continue to observe what happened in Stockton and other areas that there are folks that are unhappy, and we'll, I think, continue to see other efforts outside of labor try to restrict our ability as well. That's a short.
Thank you both. And our last speaker is Duff Sondheim.
Thank you. Last speaker, huh? So,
You get the last word.
yeah, I'm with you between you and lunch. Well, thank you all for being here today. I want to start off by saying I don't think this is necessarily contrary to what my colleagues have said, but I never really thought that the standard for the future of California was what was happening on the streets of Syria. I think that we really have and I'm glad to hear that our bond payments are going to be fulfilled and that we're not going to have massive local bankruptcies. But we do have major problems in this state. And I think one of the major problems is our pension system. But an even bigger problem than our pension system is our failure to pay for public employee health care. So, you know, my vision is, what do we need to do not to prevent a situation like Syria from occurring in California, but how does California retain its leadership, get back to its leadership position in the world? And one of the major stumbling blocks to that is our pension system. So let me just say, if you have any system, there are 2 components that make that system successful. One is the rules, and second is the people that make the decisions. For example, let's look at the NFL. The NFL has some very good rules. However, this year, they have substitute refs. And we're seeing what can happen when you have perfectly good rules, but you have people that don't have a clue how to implement those rules. What happens? You have complete chaos on the field. Well, in our pension system, we not only have some very questionable decisions that have been made by the people that are in charge, but we also have to restructure the rules. And I think that's going to require an initiative, and I think both Governor Brown and Mayor Reed and other people that you'll hear from will agree that it requires both a change in the decision makers and a change in the rules. So first, with respect to the decision makers, if you're looking at the decision makers in the state of California today, it starts, and some people would say it stops, with the public employee unions. And this is not a partisan discussion I'm going to be making. In fact, most of the heroes that I reference in my presentation are Democrats, because they understand that it is a real problem, and they're concerned about the programs that are not being funded because all this money is going to the pension system. but no less than Willie Brown, the former Democratic Assembly leader and former Democratic mayor of San Francisco, said in the old days, it was the railroads and the companies that ran the state of California. Today, it's the public employee pension system, and I totally agree. I was at an event earlier this week with a major business person in the area, and he went to a Democratic legislator and asked for some help on a bill. And that legislator said, you know what, until you match the amount of money that's given to me by the public employee unions, you're really not going to have much of a sway with what I'm going to do up in Sacramento. And if you think that that really doesn't play out, it does, in real ways that has a real impact on this state. Recently, there were a whole bunch of teachers in California that were engaged in some very negative behavior down in Los Angeles. It included having sex with some of the students. And so a Democratic legislator who was concerned about this introduced legislation up in Sacramento to make it easier to get these child predators out of the classroom. The unions prevented that change from happening at the Sacramento level. So they, even if you have people that are child predators, you're having trouble getting them out of the classroom because of the power that the unions have. Well, how did this play out in the pension area? Well, this year, when the pension measure first came before the legislature, the bill that they initially took to the governor said, well, we can't totally agree on what to do about spiking, we can't agree what to do about how much employees should contribute, but we do agree that we should undo the reforms that were made in San Diego and San Jose. And that was their solution to the problem. Well, to Governor Brown's credit, he threw them out of his office, and this is absolutely ridiculous, come back with something. And so they did come back with something. And that something deals with about 10% of the problem. That's a good start. And the principle that they came away with, if I was going to look at this in a positive sense, is that they said, you know what, we have to have the concept that the employees are going to have some responsibility for paying for the pensions. If I was going to look at it cynically, I could say what they did is they got rid of spiking and airtime and all the things that would have looked really good if you were running an initiative campaign statewide to try to get real pension reform. And so they took those things off the table. But no matter how you look at it, I think they've effectively dealt with approximately 10% of the problem. And it's not just the legislature. We also have problems with CalPERS. I remember Willie Brown went on to the CalPERS board. At one point, he went to a few meetings, and I talked with him after that, and he said, I got to get out of there. I have to get off that board. I don't think too many people on that board understand the concept of fiduciary responsibility. And I think that the way that has played out in the municipal bankruptcy situation is in Vallejo, where everybody came to the table and put their concerns on the table. CalPERS refused to negotiate. CalPERS contributed nothing to the solution that Vallejo came up with, and consequently that's one of the reasons that Vallejo, while it's out of bankruptcy, is still in a lot of ways still a zombie city. And they did the same thing in Stockton. They bullied the Stockton people to prevent them from doing anything with respect to the pensions. And then, fortunately, somebody stood up to the bully, and it was the bondholders. And the bondholders went to the federal court and said, you know what, this is ridiculous. Everybody has some skin in the game. We need to have the pension people at the table. And to the credit of the judge who was hearing that case, he has indicated that that is a correct assumption, that when you're in a bankruptcy situation, CalPERS does have a responsibility to try to make a positive contribution. Governor Brown also sees the governance as a major issue in the state of California. And at the bill signing, he even, this legislation that was recently passed, he did indicate that we did have to deal with and clean up the boards, the pension boards, not only CalPERS, but the boards throughout the state. So, where are we? Do we need, and how do we get out of this mess? And can we get out of this mess? Absolutely. But it's going to take those two things I talked about. It's going to take a change in the rules, and it's going to need a change by the decision makers. In terms of the rules, we do have to do an initiative. And that initiative is necessary because we do need to change our state constitution. I'm not a big proponent of the initiative process. It should be used sparingly and only on big things. It's a blunt instrument, but I agree with Governor Brown and Mayor Reed that in this situation, an initiative is required. And it is required to do the following. We need to protect the gains that were made in San Jose and San Diego so that future legislators don't come in to undo the changes that they made. We need to protect the concept that the employees have an obligation to make a contribution to the solution. And we need to set a constitutional standard where we give the public employee the same right that a private sector employee has, no more, no less. That, in other words, the pension right that you have vested up to this point cannot be changed. But with respect to future pension accruals, that should and can be changed if the economic circumstances require. So those are the types of things I think why we need a constitutional amendment in the form of an initiative. But even if we get those changes, we're still going to need solid decisions being made by the decision makers throughout the state if we're going to turn this state around and to be the leader that California can be, not only in the United States, but in the world.
Thank you, Duff. So we have a good 20 minutes for questions. In the back.
My first question was, could you discuss, you used the number in your chart of up no more than 10% is pension cost. What does that 10% represent?
Okay, what you were looking at the far column. That's an extract from a spreadsheet that we keep that includes maybe 50 columns, but that's the actuarially required contribution by the community for that year's pension
Okay, so that's the normal cost.
Excuse me, 1 second.
Yeah.
That would be just for that 1 year. So as you look at the contribution that's required for that 1 year as a percentage of the overall expenditures, it ranged from, I think it was low of 4 up to 18%. The point, however, as you look at it through time, which that chart didn't do, and it gets to Duff's point, and to anybody else, David Crane is here, and there are other people that will speak to this, Joe Nathan, it's growing with time. And that's where is there a crisis there? Potentially, is it polemical? Potentially, but it's an actuarial problem, okay? It's not really affecting the day-to-day operation. And really, when you look at a local government, you're talking about police and fire service.
Okay, so if I may follow up for
Sure,
a second.
please.
So what I hear you saying is that that's the total, that's the contribution, the annual contribution. As we know, that annual contribution includes a normal cost and an amortization on the unfunded liability, right? And as we understand, the amortization on the unfunded liability is like making a credit card payment on a long-term debt. And as we understand, that would be for past service credit, correct?
Help me, but you may know more than I. Keep going.
Okay. So my question to you is, have you looked at what the total debt is, not the payment on the unfunded liability, but the actual amount of the unfunded liability as a ratio of the general fund or the payroll of the city? And then if you consider the implications of the fact that it is for past service, it is not for future service.
No, I follow, absolutely. Yeah, we pay attention to that. It's just not on the chart. Absolutely, what you're
And
describing
what do you find?
it's different in every community, and I think you can look at Mike Coleman or anyone else here. There, in some communities, it's quite large, in others, it's not as large. So when you look at the unfunded actuarial requirement, UAAL. It's different in every community, and so it's going to depend oftentimes on what the contracted relationships are. And it's a quilt. It's not a singular thread in California, because we have what I laid out was maybe 5,000 different public service jurisdictions, which include schools.
What I'm finding is...
I would like to, excuse me, I want to get other people in the discussion. We only have 15 more minutes, so I think there was a gentleman up here. If you can also identify yourself, please, before...
I'm sorry, Duff's got
Sorry, just adding one point. I think Mayor Reed would totally disagree with you as to the impact of the pension obligation is having on current services. You've seen a drastic reduction in the amount of police he's been able to put on the street, and a unbelievable rise in the number of homicides directly related to that reduction in the police force. And I think that's being played out throughout the state. So I see it much more of a crisis than an accrual problem.
We might agree. There's San Jose's complex, but property value contraction does very much affect what's going on in the loss of redevelopment. But property value contraction is a very important component there, and pensions are a very important component. We probably will at the end agree, Duff. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Lance Holman. I'm president of Holman Capital, and our company structures private placement transactions for municipalities. I listened to everybody, and I just got a very simple question. What role does the public have to become more educated about the management of their government? I mean, we sit back and have all these fancy rules. At the end of the day, it's the public that has to become more educated so that we can make better financial decisions. And then, quite frankly, they need to better manage their own homes. And if they better manage their own homes, they would demand more of the politicians that they elect. That's what I got.
Is that a statement or a question? I mean, I'm sorry, but I finance a nonprofit check cashing center down in Fruitvale, and was set up to do financial literacy. The notion of financial literacy in this country is very complicated, and yes, we all agree it's a problem.
Well, I'm a little reluctant to blame the ordinary citizen who's just trying to make ends meet, and I'm involved in this campaign right now called Proposition 32. And if you listen to the no on 32, which is being funded by the special interest, the public pensions, it makes them sound like if you're against special interests, you should vote no on 32, and they're pouring $50–60 million into that. So a lot of times it's hard for the average citizen to understand what the issues really are. And I think even given that, yes, there is a responsibility at the individual level, but where I've seen a total failure is at the decision maker level. And where I see that that is achievable is that you look at people not only like Chuck Reed in San Jose, Bob Foster in Long Beach, you see other people that are telling the truth. But it's just a matter of whether we elect people that are going to tell the truth to people as what's going on, because right now the people are being lied to about the magnitude of the problem. And I think, frankly, we've seen what I feel is a little bit of a failure to live up to that even in some of the presentations this morning.
Can I?
But if you don't do your own due diligence, you can be easily led.
So there's another overlay here, which is where we are with elected officials and what we have representing us locally and in Sacramento, and in an era of term limits, where people are always, from the day they're elected to a 6-year term, 3 2-year terms of the legislature, already maneuvering for when they can go for that Senate seat, and then from there, who knows where, and from the council up, you have people who are making decisions based on getting elected as opposed to looking at the longer game. Now, that may change now that we're going to start to see people who can spend 12 years in Sacramento in one of the houses. I don't know, but I would think that maybe people will up there, they may be more willing to make tough decisions. But I think part of what we saw a slide in the last presentation about the ballot box, legislating the ballot box, and where we've gone with the initiative process, it gets very complicated. And I think it's reasonable for people to assume that they have educated, informed decision makers in Sacramento who are making the tough decisions. And yeah, the public has some responsibility to understand and know what's going on, but this is not the kind of stuff that the average person can grasp or should be forced to grasp on an everyday level. I mean, we need some leadership who will step up and make these tough decisions and not pass the buck.
Excuse me, I'll be on the panel this afternoon, John Elwood at Berkeley. Where's the other side? I've heard your union bashing, that's nice for all of you. I want someone in the audience to give me the perspective of the cops, the fire people, the teachers.
I think I'm doing that, sir.
Oh, no, you're not. Come
Absolutely.
on. The Republican Party's in the business of bashing unions, and you're bashing unions, and I deal with Crane, and I deal with Borenstein over there. I want to hear the argument. I'm not saying they're right. I want to know what the argument is. They're not here. They're not on the panel.
They were invited, but I believe they were invited, but didn't show.
Then why don't they show? Does anybody tell us?
You're a
okay,
Labor guy.
what's your argument? They want to take away your pension.
That's totally untrue, sir. That's just not the case. No, I'm not even for reduction. I'm not even for reduction
Let's understand
in the
what
benefits.
you folks have done to the private sector. You've eliminated most of the defined benefit pensions in this country. People are now down to defined contributions. They got slaughtered in the crash of 2008. There's lots of research at CBO about people worrying about whether or not they have enough money for retirement. And you want to do for the public sector what you did to the private sector, and you want to do it on the grounds, well, we can't afford it in the private sector, so why should we give people in the public sector all this goodie? The people who are getting the great deal out there in terms of the public sector are police, fire, and corrections folks. Those are the folks who are retiring at 50, and being able to draw things. Are you willing to take them on?
I certainly am.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but it's a statement, and we're all probably going to agree with your statement. I'm looking for a question in that. You've asked where's union representation. It's really not here with the other side. It's an unsustainable situation. I'm saying that there's not necessarily a crisis. Duff is saying there is a crisis. I think we both agree that the situation we're in right now isn't sustainable.
And
What I think is a crime is you're telling the 25-year-old teacher that's putting that money into the system that she's going to get money when she retires. It's not going to be there, sir.
Yes,
and what
it
I'm
is.
saying, I care about that person, and I want to make sure that this system is sustainable.
Why is it not going to be there?
Because they're not putting enough money into the system for the benefits they're withdrawing.
But the
It's
money
a math issue. It's not an ideological issue.
The money she's putting in there will be there. The question is, what's the appropriate rate of return? And there's a disagreement about
And whether
that.
she's putting in enough money for the benefit that she's entitled to under defined benefit. It's a math issue. It's not an ideological issue.
I agree.
It is not, well, it's also a political issue because in the case of UC Berkeley, for example, the state has not put a cent into the retirement system for 22 years.
Totally
That
agree.
is a political judgment on the part of the legislature.
And a bad one.
Fine. But that's not what everybody's doing here.
So I was trying to find that quote from Madison that if
And
men...
this is Tracy.
Yeah, sorry, Tracy Gordon Brookings. I was trying to find that quote about if men were angels, we wouldn't need government
Yes.
or something like that. But I'm struck, is there an institutional fix for this kind of political conflict? And I read recently about, and since there are so many public finance people in the room, I thought I would take this opportunity as someone who's kind of fascinated by muni bond markets on the outside to ask this question. Pension obligation bonds. So a lot of places that cannot make their annual required contributions or choose not to basically borrow and sort of double down and hope that they're going to earn enough on the market to meet that obligation, putting it very crudely. I've read about an instance, I think in Florida, where those pension obligation bonds included restrictive covenants that would require them to basically undertake pension reforms and to make their ARC. So is there a way of, because it seems like what we're saying right now is there's a political problem, people won't do what they should do because they're not angels, basically, and we haven't figured out how to design rules to make them do that. Is there some way of outsourcing enforcement to the public finance community, to bondholders, by having those kinds of restrictive covenants on pension obligation bonds? It struck me as similar to a proposal by Lieutenant Governor Ravitch in New York to try to create a control board for the state of New York by having covenants on state bonds, much like California's bonds for borrowing. So are there creative solutions? You hear about financial engineering. Are there creative solutions from the finance community to help with this enforcement problem, which we all recognize as a problem?
Well, this is Tom. It's no more creative than the rate of return. The contribution rate is, let's say, at 7, and your borrowing rate is at 5. You borrow at 5, you're better off than paying at 7, and that's really the logic. I don't know about Florida. Unfortunately, I'm very seriously a regionalist, and I'm not somebody that's structured and underwritten a great deal of pension debt. It's a long-term investment in making that payment. If, as we've got right now, the actual rate of return in CalPERS and CalSTRS is less than 2%, but you're assuming an appreciation rate of 7.5, having come down from 7 3/4. Mathematically, it doesn't work. We're all going to agree. Now, if you don't like democracy, the way you solve it is more democracy, and I think what Duff is suggesting is the initiative process, and fortunately we have that in California, and I think that's where it's probably going to come. But in terms of trying to create an architecture or a system, you can combine pension with a lot of really ugly names, and you can enter the market at a pretty low rate. I mean, the market's pretty forgiving. So I don't want to necessarily see that architecture, but I do believe that the way to solve this is with democracy, and I believe in the initiative system, and that's what I really like about California. However messy it might be, if you don't like it, more of it's how you solve it.
There's another question there.
My name is Kathleen Thompson with California Public Employee Relations. It's a journal. For Mr. Sunheim, you said something about the pension reform legislation that was just passed.
Yes.
Having solved only 10% of the problem. How do you get there mathematically?
Sure. I talked with Mayor Reed, who's looked at this issue very closely, and that was his guesstimate on it. Again, I think it's a really good start because it does talk about the concept of the employees paying a higher percentage. But really, I think that I'll also talk with other people that have done this independently, people at Stanford, people at UC Irvine, and they all say that it's a decent start. But really, all you've done is that you're dealing with the new employees. You really haven't changed your ability to require the current employees to increase their contribution. So until you come up either through an initiative or some other means to increase the obligation of the current employees, you're really not going to have a major impact on the problem for 20, 30 years. And you have a current accrual problem of $200 to $500 billion. I think Bornstein would probably agree with my assessment on that as well. So I think, there's a lot of argument as to whether it's 10 or 15 or 20. I don't think, I was on a panel, was at an event the other day, Michael Allen, played a key role in this, was on the panel with Reed when he said 10%, and I saw him shaking his head. So I don't think there's huge disagreement on that.
If I may, sorry.
Pardon me?
At best, it's 13, and CalPERS is uncovered.
Okay, CalPERS puts it at 13.
Well, using their numbers.
Okay.
I just wanted, if I can, just quickly, Max, a follow-up to Duff's comments. With regards to the current, or the pension reform bill, with regards to current employees and cost sharing, the survey that we did of municipalities, of cities, I should say specifically, over the last 2 years shows significant increases in employees picking up more of their contributions. So it is very clear that local governments, or at least at the city level, are recognizing the need to ask for employees to pick up the cost. And what the bill did was set out a goal for local agencies to ask current employees to pick up the cost. And the reason for not imposing that is because they felt that there were contractual issues with that you could not, you would be in violation of collective bargaining laws if you imposed cost sharing on current employees. So they wanted to be very careful, I think, in approaching how they approach current employees cost sharing.
I totally agree with that. And that's why it is very much a very important legal issue, and that's why there's the need for the initiative to spell it out.
And the only thing, other thing I'll add to that is that the bill also provided provisions that essentially allows a local government to put all of the cost on the table, including the UAAL, the unfunded actuarial accrued liability, and ask the employees to pick up it, to say, here are the costs, this is what we want to pay, this is what we want you to pay. So you can't impose it, but it at least gives you the opportunity to do that. And under the CalPERS system, which is where most of our members are, you could not do that before. In order to actually ask your employees to pick up more of the cost, it had to be attributed to some sort of a benefit increase. So I guess just my point is that employees are picking up more of the cost. I think local governments recognize the importance of that, and I think you'll continue to see that.
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, Natasha, you sort of answered some of it. But I think my question is this. There's a lot of...
Identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Max Nyman, affiliated with IGS. And I'm mainly interested in what we may not know. I mean, this is a very dynamic area. The total amount of what the obligation is gets wrapped up as a single number when, in fact, there's enormous amount of variation by jurisdiction and by local governments in terms of what's happening to their local budget, what percentage of the total budget is devoted to dealing with the pension obligation. Even the public safety component varies significantly from communities. Some places it's as low as 30%. I mean, the average is around 50%. It goes up as high in Vallejo, where it was close to 75, almost 80%. So, you know, my concern, apart from the strong positions people bring, is are we perhaps still working in the dark here, in which people are proposing legislation, proposing initiatives in a target that's moving, that's changing, and shouldn't the focus be on getting a better handle on what is actually happening, number one, particularly among locals, and secondly, what's happened to the total obligation that was, sort of touted a lot about a year and a half ago, particularly around the Stanford study, which I don't have any quibbles with, but things have changed in a year and a half and have had a huge impact on what that total obligation might or might not be.
Well, Max, I think the answer is no.
Yeah.
But it is moving, okay, and an economic expansion would help, okay. Let's all agree on that. If we had some stimulus, that whether it's an innovation or a government program, whatever, if we get stimulus and we get an expansion, it's better. It still doesn't get away from the fact that the contracts that we've got probably aren't sustainable in most cases. Okay, so it's not bright line. It's going to change year to year. It may change month to month. It's going to depend on expansion and contraction, and that's what's making it very difficult to get everybody's arms around. I mean, that's the deal. And I think the silly chart that I had up there that was essentially an eye chart shows that it runs from, and that just out of those 25 examples, from 3 to 18%. Okay, so it's very difficult to generalize. But I think we're all going to agree that there's this dragon out there that needs to be slain. And within our system, which I think is a very robust democracy, and notwithstanding term limits, an initiative process will come through that may not be perfect, and certainly what's happened with redevelopment isn't perfect, but what it's going to create is an incubator for something to replace it. Has to happen. And that's what's going to happen with pensions.
We have time for one last question.
From the labor guy.
I got a couple statements more than a question right now. Somebody asked for labor representation out here.
The answer is yes.
Yeah. So, and I could literally talk here for days.
Can you identify yourself?
Oh, Mike Augustine, Local 55, Captain, Alameda County Fire Department. For those of you out of town, you're in Alameda County. Okay, real quick. Invited, labor groups being invited. My labor leadership was not invited. The only reason why I'm here myself is I'm going to be applying for Berkeley next year, and I stumbled upon this on your website. Retirement at the age of 50. Who here is over 50? Anybody? Oh, you guys are.
We're all.
As a police or firefighter, are you going to jump over a fence and chase down a criminal at 50? Are you going to climb a ladder, bring anybody? The person next to you, can you drag them out of a building over 50? I'm 34. It's kind of tough, if you guys remember. Contributions.
The answer is yes.
Contributions. Some departments contribute more than others. Some don't. I personally do. 12% in my department. And I think it should go city by city, county by county, not a statewide mandate to contribute X, Y, Z number. But that's for the individual cities. And last thing, Prop 32, gentleman on my left was talking about these unions are fighting it and all that, and these poor people are voiceless. Like, I am the person next door. I'm not the billionaire that can contribute an easy $50 million. The unions are the people next door, and they are the citizens. So that's all I have to say.
Any last comments from the panelists? Well, let me thank you, panelists, first of all.